I want you to meet somebody. Her name is Marlene Fry. And I met her this weekend at a Mission 3.0 workshop that we were doing in Cedar Rapids. And you got to imagine that I get there at this event, and we're getting the place set up. There's 70, 80 people that are coming for the workshop. And this darling little lady walks up to me with that little smile on her face, and she says, "I've been looking for you for 55 years. And I thought, okay, I'm just not sure where to go with that. And I said, "Really?" And she held up a copy of Bob Lupton's book, Toxic Charity. And she said, "I've been waiting to meet somebody in the church world who talks like this." And I had a moment of crisis. I had to decide then and there, was I going to pretend that I was Bob Lupton or come clean that I wasn't? And so I said, "Marlene, I'm not Bob Lupton." And she had this disappointing look on her face. I said, "But I know him personally." And she got excited again. And she went on to tell me that over the last 55 years of her life, the number one disagreement her and her husband had had was over the way that they would use their charitable dollars. He was an engineer that worked on the Apollo, and so they had means throughout their lifetime, and he was a staunch believer that you just gave your money and you trusted the Lord for whatever came of it. But she looked at me, and she's got that grandmotherly look, and she looked at me with a kind of firmness and said, "But I never believed that." And she said, "I think God gave us a mind for a reason." And I'm going, wow, I am going to like this lady a lot. And she just went on to talk a little bit more about that and what she had read in the book. And I got to thinking about it, and I've been thinking about it ever since then. I've been waiting for you for 55 years. I did the math on that, and that takes us back to 1964. Now, I don't know if she meant that literally, but the irony of that in my mind was, do you realize what happened in 1964? A lot of things happened that are pretty significant, the civil rights movement, but do you realize that it was LBJ's State of the Union message in January of 1964 in which we officially launched the war on poverty? And virtually everybody in the United States, some 55 years later, and this isn't a recent thing, but over the course of the next 55 years, it became apparent that the intuitive things that were a part of what that original thing was were not healthy for the poor. They might have been intuitive, they might have seemed to be the right kind of thing, but they were not what the poor needed. It made me think a little bit of Dambisa Moyo in her book, Dead Aid, in which she says, "Deep in every liberal sensibility is a profound sense that in a world of moral uncertainty, one idea is sacred. One belief cannot be compromised. The rich should help the poor, and the form of this help should be aid." And then she goes on to say, "And yet aid has been and continues to be an unmitigated political, economic, and humanitarian disaster for most parts of the developing world." But I can't get away from that first part because it is so true that in every liberal sensibility is a profound sense that it ought to be that those with resources should simply give them to those with a lack of resources. And yet, in the same 55 years, the aid to Africa has been declared an unmitigated disaster. So where does that leave us? Well, I love the quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes in which he said, "I would not give a fig for simplicity on this side of complexity, but I would give my life for the simplicity on the other side of complexity." And so if you want to know why we're here or why we do what we do here, it's because we believe that the church needs to wrestle with that complexity. And what we try to do through Significant Matters in our Missions 3.0 work is we try to help churches navigate the complexity of moving missions beyond helping that hurts, moving missions beyond toxic charity. So what I'd like to do this morning for all of you to kind of get a context of what we're talking about here is talk about all of this in a nutshell. What is it all about? We throw around phrases as part of the work that we do, and I'd like to kind of pull all of that together in just a quick overview of what it is that we're talking about. We call this Missions 3.0. And the first thing I want you to know about this is that the stuff that we're talking about, Missions 3.0, is in and of itself an upgrade. We're not saying that everything the church has done to this point in time is a bad thing. No, the church needs an upgrade. So what is Missions 1.0? Well, we've noticed that in the life of every church, primarily, they go through 3 stages. The first stage is they become a church that gives money to the poor. And so you allocate a certain amount of the budget and you give money. That's Missions 1.0. It teaches the church to be generous people. But eventually we get tired of just giving money and we want to put volunteers to work. So Missions 2.0 is simply a church mobilizing its people to serve those in need around them. And that's a good thing. But Missions 3.0, what we have found is that money and volunteers alone has led to this dependencies. And so Missions 3.0 is simply the structures and strategy for a sustainable end goal. How do we combine money and volunteerism with the complexity that Oliver Wendell Holmes was talking about, such that we can help people create sustainable solutions to the very problems that they're struggling with? So it's a framework that begins with understanding those 3 things, and in that third Mission 3.0 upgrade, what we're basically saying is that we have to change the end goal. Because much of what happens in 1.0 and 2.0 has to do with the resource church and the volunteer experience, and a prioritization of a positive volunteer experience from the church that's getting into the game. But when we push the end goal beyond that to asking the question, what is the ultimate end that we have in mind for the very people that we're working with, now we have to start wrestling with the structures and strategies that help us get to sustainable solutions. So first of all, this is about an upgrade. But it's also a continuum. We've found that if we begin to help churches understand this broader context, that as we work with people, there's 3 different types of work that we do with them. We call it our continuum. It's emergency relief, individual betterment, and sustainable development. And the problem that's happened in much of what we do in church work today is that we have spent almost all of our energies and efforts primarily in emergency relief and individual betterment. And we've put money and volunteers into individual emergency relief and individual betterment, and it's created a kind of dependency. And so what we've needed to add, what secular philanthropy as well as the church needs to add to that continuum. Do we still do emergency relief? Absolutely. But we begin to think about when and where and when to stop. Do we still do individual betterment? Absolutely. But we have to begin to develop the sustainable development kinds of things as part of the work that we're doing. So much of what you will hear from the speakers today and other speakers on our previous years has to do with that third category of how we build into the work that we're doing things that help people get to sustainable results. So the upgrade is about the structures and strategy. The continuum is adding to what we're already doing in the area of relief and betterment, the idea of sustainable development. And then the other thing that we have to understand then is that we need to know our stakeholders. So that in every church's mission department, there is a volunteer, there is the resource church, your church, and what it wants to put into missions. There are the partners that you work with, and then there is the actual individual or the community that you're working in. And we begin to work with churches to say what's happened in these 4 areas is that there is tension. The volunteer needs a positive volunteer experience. The resource church needs stories, preferably stories of poor little children in Africa holding a bag of rice that you guys packaged and sent over there so that they can do something on a Christmas Eve service that helps the church raise more money to maybe buy some shoes for some people, because the resource church needs these stories. And then you've got partners that are doing whatever the Resource Church says that they need in order to provide a positive volunteer experience for their volunteers so that they can keep the work actually going with the very people they're trying to serve. And then you've got the people that we're trying to serve, the actual community. And do they really care whether or not your church has a positive volunteer experience? Not really. As a matter of fact, oftentimes they end up feeling objectified by the churches that come. So is the answer in all of this to just quit with volunteerism? No, that's not the answer. Every church needs to wrestle with what it means to put volunteers into meaningful service. Does it mean that the Resource Church shouldn't be asking for results and stories? No. But it does mean that we need to ask for a different kind of story. And partners. The partners that we talk to say they're the ones caught most of all in this pinch. What they need are the kinds of resources that actually help them get to the sustainable solutions for the very people that they're working with. And then, of course, people in the community that you're trying to help, what do they need? What do they want? They want answers. They want solutions. They want help. So part of what we do is help churches begin to think through those 4 domains, as we call them, and what each of them needs. And then finally, we begin to work with churches around what we call the 4 practices. If you start wrestling with what each of these groups need, then you're going to start asking yourself the question, what should we be doing to move forward? And we simply say it goes like this. You need to begin to reframe expectations and understanding. How do you do that in your church? How do you reframe the understanding that people have about the volunteer experience? How do you help them reframe their understanding of poverty? We did a cost of poverty experience here yesterday with the think tank folks. And we do that on purpose because when you take people primarily from middle class and upper middle class and you put them through a simulation of what it's like to live 4 weeks in poverty, you take people who have never experienced poverty and you give them just a short taste of that life in which you constantly feel between a rock and a hard place. And in that moment, when you do that, you open middle class and upper middle class people to maybe looking at poverty a little bit different. And if we as leaders in our mission department were doing that, we might be able to start to move people's understanding of what it means to be poor, what it means to struggle with material poverty. But it will also begin to reshape your understanding of what your answers to that should be, how you should go about, and how you should begin to function in that space. So we talk a lot with churches about what it takes over 2 to 3 years to reframe expectations and understanding in all 4 domains. The second thing we say is that every church that wants to move into this has to begin to champion collaboration. Because the truth of the matter is none of us can do this alone. I don't care how big your church is. That when the church of Jesus Christ begins to link arms with other churches and we begin to tackle these seemingly insurmountable problems, we'll begin to see the needle move in significant ways. The third thing that we say as part of these practices that churches do as they move in this direction is you have to tackle outcomes. We have to start measuring things to better understand, is this working? Are we moving the needle? And we're working with a number of different programs, one right here in the Kansas City area, to develop a metric tool for them to begin to understand if they really are doing the things that they're wanting to do. And this is fuzzy territory. It's hard territory. One of our presenters this week will talk about the research that they've done that actually shows the impact that it's having in the people that they're working with. The church needs to step into that space. We can begin to figure out how to measure, what to measure, to inform the decisions that we make and to see whether or not we're moving the needle on certain things. And I would argue that the more we do that, the more relevant we will become to the culture as a whole. And then the last thing is we say that churches that are Mission 3.0 churches are going to begin to cultivate innovation. We're going to begin to create space, especially for the business-minded people, invite them into that space and ask them to help us create some solutions to the things that we're wrestling with. And you're going to hear some of those stories in the next couple of days, cultivating innovation for what the church could do to get to more sustainable solutions. And that's it. It's just that simple. It's really not that complicated if you break the framework down into those components. But the truth is, nobody has all the answers. And the presenters that you're going to hear this week, as well as those that are on the website, they're just examples of what church missions could be. It's going to take individual congregations with a courage and a willingness to push into uncharted waters for us to move church missions into the new and emerging space that's before us. Committed to helping people in the here and now in the same ways that we're trying to prepare them for the hereafter. There's a story from the life of Dr. David Livingstone in which some emerging missionary agencies sent him a letter saying, "Have you found some good roads to where you are? If so, we'd like to send you some helpers." To which Livingstone replied, "If you have found men who will only come if there's a good road, I don't want them. I want men who will come even if there is no road at all." And every year as we plan for SAT Talks, we look for the Livingstones who are already going places where there are no roads. You'll hear their stories, and there's another 50 out on the website. And why do we do this? Quite frankly, it's in the hope that your church, your congregation, would take its own mission work, where there are no roads at all. Thank you.